This video was sponsored by MUBI, a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/bekindrewind. Scream Queens is not just a term to describe, I hate to say it, some of Ryan Murphy's best work. It's a label often applied to some of the most beloved, iconic horror performances in cinematic history. Yet, as seemingly well-known and infamous as the term is, it remains, as Alison Foreman and Kate Erblond put it in IndieWire, a half-funny play on words, nebulously defined, and as outdated as the surface-level conceit describes. So if the term is an old-fashioned one, where exactly did it come from? Actress Fay Wray is often credited with being American cinema's first scream queen, specifically for her performance in 1933's King Kong. After reading listicle after listicle citing Wray as the first, my question became, why? Horror films have existed since the invention of film. Surely other women had made a name for themselves in horror by 1933. Why then would this actress in this performance be considered the first? How has the definition changed since Kong took her up to the top of the Empire State Building? To help answer these questions, I interviewed Anna Bogutskaya, host of MUBI's Haunted Homes, a podcast that explores how haunted house movies have mirrored our relationships to our homes, and the author of Feeding the Monster, Why Horror Has a Hold on Us, which examines how horror responds to and fuels our feelings of fear, anxiety, pain, hunger, and power. So, let's get started with the original. Fay Wray made her film debut at 16 years old in 1923's Gasoline Love. After graduating from the famed Hollywood High School, which many of the earliest movie stars attended, she was signed to a contract with producer Hal Roach and starred in a series of short Western films. In 1926, she was selected as a Wampus Baby Star of the Year, which is like an annual list of up-and-coming actresses to watch. And 1926 proved to be particularly prescient as far as picking out the next generation of stars goes, with Mary Astor, Janet Gaynor, Dolores Del Rio, and Joan Crawford all making the list. In 1928, she nabbed a role in Erich von Stroheim's The Wedding March, and although that film was not a hit by any means, it did confirm Wray as an actress to watch. The films The Four Feathers with Gary Cooper and The Unholy Garden with Ronald Colman made Wray a star and a verifiable romantic lead. With her delightful speaking voice, Wray actually survived the transition to sound. The Four Feathers was also important insofar as it brought her into the orbit of directors Marion C. Cooper and Ernest Schoedsack, who had an idea for her. Cooper called her into his office and told her he wanted her for his new project. She would have the tallest, darkest leading man in Hollywood. She thought he meant Cary Grant. She never would have guessed he meant. In the years since 1933, King Kong has become one of the most identifiable pop culture icons on Earth. There have been remakes of the original film, multiple animated series, and most recently, an entire monsterverse built around him and Godzilla. This isn't a dig, I unironically love these movies, but if the primary context in which you interact with King Kong is this, then it might not be completely intuitive why King Kong was considered a horror film at all, much less one prominent enough to launch a term so intimately tied to the horror genre. But make no mistake, Kong was and is considered a horror picture, one that astonished audiences, dominated the box office, and revolutionized special effects. Unlike many of the Universal horror monsters made cinematically famous in the early 1930s, King Kong was not an adaptation of a famous novel or a folktale. Rather, he emerged from the imagination of Cooper and Schoedsack, who had become famous for their wildlife documentary/adventure pictures that pushed the technical boundaries of filmmaking.
Cooper, always wanting to push the envelope, at the end of Chang, wanted to do something different with the elephant stampede. It was this huge stampede of elephants that was coming through a village and tearing down the huts and the people running and babies crying and everything. They ended up doing this process called magnoscope. The picture would get bigger at a certain point, at the climax of a movie.
The effect was astonishing. With the screen opening up and the elephants charging, and it looked like they were coming right out at you.
After directing The Four Feathers, Cooper joined RKO as a producer, where he finally had the opportunity to pitch a film he'd been thinking about for years, a film that would allow the duo to combine their interests in adventure films and technical innovation. King Kong takes the real-life exploring Cooper and Schoedsack did and turns it into a fantasy. Broad strokes as a reminder, filmmaker Carl Dunham recruits a young woman named Anne Darrow, who's down on her luck in Depression-era America, to join his venture to Skull Island, where he hopes to capture footage of a mysterious, legendary creature called Kong. During the visit, Anne is kidnapped and offered to King Kong as his bride. The crew successfully rescues Anne, captures Kong, and brings him to New York City, where they plan to charge urban, civilized audiences to gawk at him. He breaks free, finds Anne, and in that iconic sequence tries to escape up the Empire State Building, where he is ultimately shot down and killed.
It was beauty killed the beast.
No, bitch, it was you. You snatched a wild animal out of his home and then shot it down from an airplane. It was you. Anyway, on a base level, the idea that a giant monster could reach into your bedroom window and drop you to your death is obviously pretty scary. But it's also important to understand that the film utilized a familiar horror formula for audiences in the early 1930s: jungle horror. Films in this subgenre told stories of white Westerners who found themselves in exotic locations and at the mercy of violent, uncivilized locals. Whether via a shipwreck or a plane crash or safari gone wrong, these films exploited the unfamiliarity of non-Western cultures to generate fear.
It clearly came out of really colonialist and really racist mentalities in the same way that early horror films like White Zombie and other ones have also really thorny and racist lineages, where they come out of a place where they think that anything that is not Anglican or American is quote unquote savage and dangerous by default, and all monsters are cultural products. So King Kong, in a way, is a very visual and very big expression of this white fears of what they think might happen if they let anyone from outside of their particular Western civilization into Western civilization.
White women played a key role in this subgenre, framed as the pure, beautiful damsels in contrast to the indigenous non-white women, and in need of rescue from the brutish, feral non-white men. Rona Berenstein writes in her article, White Heroines and Hearts of Darkness, Race, Gender, and Disguise in 1930s Jungle Films, the central position of a white actress in most jungle films is far from neutral in ideological terms. Not only does she invoke an old-age racist rape fantasy, but her presence also recasts historical realities. In the history of American race relations, especially during slavery, Black women were the victims of white rapes, attacks that occurred well within the geographical borders of the United States. As indicated by jungle movies, white women fall prey to Black creatures in the wilds of the Third World, far from the racial tensions of their homeland.
Never equaled in its amazing thrills, Trader Horn reveals the long-hidden secrets of the Dark Continent. As a safari is menaced by the mysteries of the jungle, so wild and weird as to be almost unbelievable. And more dangerous than the herds of animals are the hordes of bloodthirsty cannibals, the curious, fantastic pygmy warriors. They are willing to trade their lives to find the girl, the beautiful white goddess of paganism.
Sometimes these films would even work under the guise of documentary, like 1931's The Blonde Captive, which utilized actual documentary footage of indigenous populations in East Asia and Australia, but then added a totally fabricated arc about how explorers were on an expedition to find a white woman who had been living with a tribe after she survived a shipwreck.
There's nothing Neanderthal about her. Why, she might walk the streets of Liverpool or Topeka, but not in this costume. At any rate, she surely is a white woman.
In 1930, Ray herself starred in another one of these films, The Sea God, in which a scuba diver is mistaken for a god by indigenous island cannibals when he emerges from the sea in his diving suit. He, of course, has to save Ray after her boat sinks. Kong definitely plays into these fears and tropes, so in many ways, Anne Darrow wasn't a huge stretch for Ray. She'd played that archetype already. For the first half of the film, the role requires everything you'd expect from a typical ingenue. Charm, elegance, beauty, charisma with her love interest, which she handles well. The second half of the film, however, asks Ray to play a damsel in distress, and this damsel had to scream a lot. This is the most laughably obvious answer to the question I'm posing in this video. She is called a scream queen because she screams a lot. Simple enough. Even contemporary critics noticed just how often she screamed and eagerly pointed it out in their reviews. Variety's critic found the screaming overwhelming, calling the film a 96-minute screaming session for her, and saying that it was a wonder Kong didn't drop her and look for a non-screamer, even if he had to settle for a brunette. Mordaunt Hall wrote in the New York Times, "It seems as though Anne Darrow would faint, but she always appears to be able to scream." But it's worth noting the effect her scream had, and continues to have. Because yes, she screams, but not all screams are created equal. And critics and audiences alike have come to the consensus that Fay Wray was simply really good at it. Upon her death, Stephen Hunter of the Washington Post wrote a lovely obituary that captures what I think people heard in Ray's screams. You can't really call a Fay Wray scream just a scream. It was too rich, dense, urgent, primal, too complete. It wasn't just a noise, it was agony and fear and hopelessness. It carried with it a tragic conviction that civilization was an illusion, and it was driven forward largely by the possibility that Mr. Right would turn out to be a 40-foot-tall monkey. You'd scream too, though probably without as much eloquence, beauty, or class. As with anything in Hollywood, Ray's skill was immediately exploited.
On King Kong, she once was required to work 22 hours straight. Also on Kong, the director told her to scream for your life into a microphone for 8 uninterrupted hours so he could get the exact pitch he wanted for the soundtrack. For weeks afterward, she couldn't speak even in a whisper.
Known as the Aria of the Agonies, her screams were recorded and recycled as part of RKO's sound effects library. Walter Elliott, a sound designer at RKO, gave interviews in which he called Ray a champion screamer and claimed that he had used her recordings to replace the screams of actors like Katharine Hepburn and Ginger Rogers. As film writer Anthony Ambrogio observed, the scream was a necessary ingredient to the emerging horror film. And this is an important part, that a scream is a sound. We have to remember that for the audiences of 1933, sound film was a relatively new technology that had only recently become the norm. Maybe they had been terrified by Nosferatu or Haxan or The Phantom Carriage, but sound provided filmmakers a new way to scare audiences in the 1930s. I think we can still respect how haunting and astounding these silent films are, while also acknowledging how a maniacal laugh, an eerie howl, or a blood-curdling scream can add new layers to a film.
Some of the horror films that have scared me personally the most, and I remember sounds before I remember images. And that soundscape, and it's not music, it's sound design. It can be the voice, it can be how someone screams or how someone whispers. It can be like how you can hear whisper almost behind your ear on your neck.
audiences had enthusiastically imagined what, for example, Mary Philbin might sound like when she finally unmasked the Phantom of the Opera. And it's not as if no one had ever screamed before in a film. But if you go back and watch the most famous horror films released around the same time as King Kong, the sound design is quite minimal. Some of their most memorable imagery is played almost silently. And oddly enough, all of the screams in Dracula occur off-screen. Frankly, I still think this is really effective, but it's also understandable why Fay Wray's scream might, if you'll pardon the phrase, cut through the noise. Cooper and Schoedsack really stick the landing, with holding Kong until the 45-minute mark and choreographing a real sense of pageantry around his reveal, only to pierce the tension with her voice.
Sound will not just give you kind of the element of danger, especially through her scream, because especially in this film, a lot of it has to do with scale, right? You have to see this enormous Kong and the tiny, tiny real human woman that he's holding. So her scream actually becomes as big as the monster itself. It's the thing that gives you a sense of like danger and scale, but also reminds you that it's not, I mean, it is a puppet, but it's not a puppet and it's a real life person that he's threatening.
This scene, the initial meeting of Kong and Anne, is just one example of the truly extraordinary effects developed by Cooper, Schoedsack, and especially animator Willis O'Brien, who summoned virtually every available technology to complete this film. Rear projection, matte paintings, claymation. They really pulled out all the stops.
And Obi, when he couldn't do something, he would get drunk and disappear for 3 or 4 days.
Oh, boy. Do you see him? Do you think a depressed person could make this? No.
And look, I get it. Some modern viewers might look at the technology used in King Kong and find it comically primitive. No pun intended. To us, this looks exactly like what it is: 2 dolls made to fight with each other. We like things much more realistic, obviously, like this. It's not that the audiences back then were so innocent that they didn't notice. They did. Reviews mention audiences giggling and often noted the jerkiness of the special effects. However, they also committed themselves to the suspension of disbelief, I think, much more ardently than we do today. Your eyes become accustomed to the action, and you fall under the spell of the illusion. Variety's 1933 review conceded that after the audience becomes used to the machine-like movements and other mechanical flaws in the gigantic animals on view and become accustomed to the phony atmosphere, they may commence to feel the power. These effects undoubtedly contributed to King Kong's strength as a horror film. Kong and how he was made became the subject of much more press coverage than Wray ever would. Although the film was easily the biggest thing she'd done to date and did the kinds of numbers one might assume would elevate her to a new echelon of stardom, that wasn't exactly the case. See, prior to King Kong, Wray had actually just starred in a string of horror films. Dr. X, a kind of serial killer thriller made in 2-strip Technicolor, The Most Dangerous Game, the infamous tale of a rich man so bored with his life that he hunts human beings for sport. This was actually directed by Schoedsack and repurposed sets from the concurrently filming King Kong to save money. The Vampire Bat, a pretty boring Dracula knockoff, and Mystery at the Wax Museum, another Technicolor film in which a murderous sculptor preserves his victims in wax. In other words, she happened to star in one of the biggest horror films of all time on the heels of similar and modestly successful performances. So her success in Kong didn't encourage people to want something different. Instead, it seemed to confirm her path. People wanted more of the same. It got to the point that when Wray walked into auditions, casting directors always asked her to scream. She starred in Black Moon in 1934 as a young girl who escapes voodoo sacrifice on a tropical island. In 1935, she starred in The Clairvoyant as a fortune-telling grifter's object of affection. Horror became her niche. She is admittedly the most prolific screamer on or off the screen. Fay Wray seems to have a penchant for horror pictures, and beyond a doubt she is the most capable actress we know of for the exacting role of a young woman reacting to fear and the menace of horror. This typecasting is essentially another reason why Fay Wray is considered the first Scream Queen, because the term describes not just that literal ability to scream and scream well, but also a relationship with the film industry.
I like to think of a Scream Queen as more of a marketing tool and something that has more to do with actresses and actors more generally, if you want to have that term be as inclusive as possible, who are playing roles in a lot of horror films. So they become sort of attached or enmeshed with the genre because they frequently have roles in genre films. Scream Queens and Scream Kings are referring more to the performers, to the actresses and the actors, and how they engage with the horror community, how they engage with horror culture, whether they're doing convention, their roles in other horror shows and movies, whether they are quite happy and open and kind of participating in the legacy of their roles, whether they continue appearing in the franchises.
Wray wasn't necessarily happy about this. She had ambitions as an actress and felt King Kong limited her opportunities. "I'm dissatisfied with my work," she said. "I want to be a really good actress, and I don't think I am. With the exception of Mitzi in The Wedding March, I've never had a part that I felt exactly suited me or to which I could give myself." So she became a fugitive from Kong and moved to England to work, hoping for a clean slate. It took years for her to come around to how important and influential her performance in King Kong had become. It's not really that Fay Wray was literally the first woman to scream in a film, or that she was even the first actress to be known for her performances in horror films. It's that she defined the term for the modern industry. While there were complex, fascinating roles for women in horror throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, like Gloria Holden in Dracula's Daughter and Simone Simon in Cat People, the Scream Queen became a kind of shorthand for a Darrow-adjacent damsel in distress role. Actresses like Yvette Vickers, Julie Adams, Evelyn Ankers, and Anne Gwynn took up Fay Wray's mantle as the panic-stricken, constantly fleeing Scream Queens of American cinema, often taking roles in a B-movie brand of horror, as opposed to actresses like Julie Harris or Deborah Carr, who occasionally dabbled in the genre but were known for other things. As horror has evolved as a genre, new archetypes have emerged, complicating the concept of the Scream Queen. Perhaps the most famous of these is the Final Girl, a much more active, dynamic archetype introduced by Carol G. Clover in her book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws: Gender in the Modern Horror Film.
The Final Girl is an archetype. It's a type of character, usually, the last woman standing, the last person standing in a horror film, the one that survives the killer, the one that survives to tell the tale and continue the story. The original meaning of that term is specific to slasher films, and specific to American slasher films that really rose to prominence in the 70s and early 80s. Your Nightmare on Elm Street, your Texas Chainsaw Massacres, your Friday the 13th, and Halloween, obviously. But I think all Final Girls are Scream Queens, but not all Scream Queens are Final Girls.
So you have someone like Janet Leigh, a Scream Queen for her iconic, influential performance in Psycho, but not really a Final Girl, versus someone like her daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis, who became the quintessential Final Girl in Halloween, and whose involvement in the franchise over several decades has basically defined her career. So, where does the term go from here?
I think it immediately harkens back to a more simple vision of horror films. I think over the past 20 years, really, and specifically over the past decade, horror films have become, have been taken so much more seriously, for the better, obviously. So I think that term is such a commercially minded one and such a flippant one to a point that it doesn't really feel connected to the flavor and interest of horror films of the past decade. Like, you wouldn't really call Florence Pugh a Scream Queen because of Midsommar, because I think those roles are so earnest and so interested in character that they're not there just to be the foil of a big monster. They're not there just to survive. they're very often they can be, sort of like outsized and campy, like Pearl is in the entire trilogy and in Maxine as well. But when I think about the horror of like Essie Davis in The Babadook, or Rebecca Hall in The Night House, or Florence Pugh in Midsommar, or Lupita Nyong'o in Us, or any of these films, like even though they're screaming, even though technically they fit that bill, none of those performances or those roles or their characters feel gimmicky, and the term itself does feel that way. And I do find it quite interesting that it's like even the way that horror and women are being written about by more mainstream publications has sort of taken a step back from that. I think it's a playful, gimmicky term that absolutely has its place, but I don't think it correlates or connects with the type of horror films that are being produced over the past 10-15 years.
No matter where the term itself goes, what remains true is that horror is such a fertile, engaging ground for women. The Gina Davis Institute published a report that stated just one genre featured women on screen more than men: horror. These roles have only become more complex and interesting as time has moved on. And you can see that not just with the roles Anna mentioned, but in awards conversations. Some of the biggest Oscar snubs of the past decade that fans are still upset about are horror performances. I'll complain to the end of time about the Toni Collette Hereditary snub. So after all this, I had one question on my mind. Is Demi Moore a scream queen now? Anna thinks of The Substance as...
I think of it like as an updated take on the Psycho Biddy.
Which is probably why I'm so obsessed with it. The exploitation rife within the entertainment industry, our perception of aging, destructive beauty standards, it's all in the story of Elizabeth Sparkle, an actress who turned her faded fame into an aerobics empire, only to be kicked out once she hits 50 years old. In desperation, she takes The Substance, an underground injectable serum that births a new, hotter, younger version of herself. At first, having a new body is a thrill, but she doesn't anticipate the ways in which the symbiotic relationship will affect her. This film is funny, outrageous, extremely stylized, strange, and full of references to classic horror films for dedicated fans to pick out. I definitely would caution folks who aren't comfortable with gore or body horror to do some research before you hit play, but for those of us who are big Cronenberg or even David Lynch fans, I highly recommend checking this film out. I haven't had as much fun in the theater this season as I have with The Substance, and I don't think I'm alone in that. The film is having a record-breaking run in theaters, but just in case you weren't able to see it during that time, or if you just want to revisit it at your own leisure, you can do that right now for free on MUBI. MUBI is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. With MUBI, each and every film is hand-selected by a wonderfully talented team of curators. You can discover the best of cinema at your fingertips, streaming anytime, anywhere. MUBI's been doing a great job with new releases, and The Substance is a great example of that. Thankfully, because MUBI is sponsoring this video, you can check out The Substance and other horror films like director Coralie Farge's debut, Revenge, right now for free. All you have to do is click the link in my description below or go to mubi.com/BeKindRewind. A whole world of cinema can be at your fingertips. Get your month free at mubi.com/BeKindRewind today.